Picture a hearth, tens of thousands of years ago, somewhere in what is now northern Iraq. Most of the group has already left before dawn, moving out across the hills to hunt. One man stays behind. He can't see clearly out of one eye. A childhood injury saw to that. One arm ends just past the elbow, withered and finally amputated years ago. He walks with a pronounced limp, and by now, deep into his life, he can no longer hear well enough to catch the warning shout of a predator closing in. By almost any measure, this man cannot hunt. He cannot fully defend himself. And yet, when archaeologists eventually found his bones, they discovered something that shouldn't have been possible if survival really came down to hunting alone. He lived to be somewhere between 35 and 45 years old, genuinely old for a Neanderthal. Here's the question hiding underneath a very old assumption. How did ancient humans survive when nobody in a group could hunt, whether because of injury, disability, illness, or simply not being physically capable of it? Most people assume the answer is grim. No hunting meant no food, meant no survival. A brutally simple equation, and anyone who couldn't contribute got left behind. The skeletal record tells a very different story, and it starts with that man from the cold open, whose remains carry one of the most quietly powerful data points in all of paleoanthropology. His name, as far as archaeology can give him one, is Shanidar I, discovered in 1957 at Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan. Researchers examining his skeleton found a crushing blow near his left eye socket, sustained when he was young, likely affecting his vision. His right forearm was withered and had been amputated at the elbow, one of the earliest known examples of an individual surviving a major amputation in the human fossil record. A healed fracture in his right foot left him with a serious limp, and a later, more detailed analysis of his ear canals found bony growths that would have caused profound hearing loss. Any one of these conditions on its own would have made hunting extremely difficult. Together, they would have made him acutely vulnerable, easy prey, in the researchers' own words, in a landscape that still had large carnivores in it. And yet every one of his injuries shows clear signs of healing. None of them killed him. He lived with all of them for years, which, as the researchers who studied him put it, reinforces something important about the basic humanity of Neanderthals. Whatever kept Shanidar I alive almost certainly wasn't his own hunting ability. It was the people around him. Now fast forward tens of thousands of years and travel to a Neolithic cemetery in Ninh Bình province, northern Vietnam. Archaeologists there uncovered a burial cataloged simply as Man Bass Burial 9 or M9, a young man roughly 20 to 30 years old at death, buried in an unusual position. On his side, flexed, facing north to south, instead of the extended face-up burial typical of the site. His skeleton told researchers why. Fused vertebrae in his neck and upper spine, consistent with a rare congenital condition called Klippel-Feil syndrome, combined with severely atrophied limb bones, point to paralysis from the waist down, and quite possibly significantly limited use of his arms as well, beginning in adolescence. Using a framework called the bioarchaeology of care, researchers reconstructed just how much support a person in his condition would have needed. Help eating, help with basic hygiene, regular repositioning to prevent pressure sores, likely a specially adapted diet to manage digestive complications from prolonged immobility. And the skeletal evidence shows he survived roughly 10 more years after his paralysis began. 10 years. In a Neolithic farming community with no modern medicine, no wheelchairs, no antibiotics, a young man who could contribute almost nothing to daily subsistence lived a full decade longer, simply because the people around him decided that was worth doing. The third case takes us to a limestone cave in Calabria, southern Italy, roughly 11,000 to 12,500 years ago, deep in the tail end of the last ice age. In 1963, archaeologists found two skeletons buried together in an embrace. For decades, based on bone shape alone, researchers assumed the smaller individual, nicknamed Romito II, was a young man with dwarfism. Recent ancient DNA analysis corrected that. Romito II was actually a teenage girl with a severe form of dwarfism called acromesomelic dysplasia, causing dramatically shortened forearms and lower legs. The adult buried embracing her, Romito I, turned out to be a close female relative, most likely her mother, or possibly a sister. Here's the detail that matters most. Her skeleton shows no signs of trauma, and her diet and general health closely match everyone else buried at the same site. She wasn't malnourished. She wasn't neglected, in a world where her condition would have made hunting and probably most long-distance foraging essentially impossible. The physical evidence says she was simply cared for, fed, protected, and in death, held. Here's where the story pulls back from these three individual lives to something much bigger, a basic misunderstanding about how ancient economies actually worked. For much of the 20th century, popular imagination, and a fair amount of early anthropology, leaned hard into the idea of man the hunter, that hunting was the central, defining, most important food-gathering activity in ancient human life. But when researchers actually went out and carefully weighed what modern foraging populations like the Hadza of Tanzania bring back to camp, day after day, the numbers told a very different story. Hunted meat accounts for roughly a third of their daily calories. Gathered plant foods, tubers, berries, baobab fruit account for closer to half. Honey and insect larvae make up another meaningful chunk on top of that. Added up, and gathering plus honey collection consistently outweighs hunting as a source of calories. Hunting matters enormously, for protein, for fat, for social prestige, but it has never been the thing standing between a group and starvation on any given day. That distinction changes everything about how we should think about someone who couldn't hunt. If hunting wasn't the load-bearing wall of ancient survival, what was? Two things, backed by real data. First, sharing. Studies of Hadza foraging behavior document extensive, routine food sharing across an entire camp, not just within individual families, meaning a bad hunting day, or a hunter who came back empty-handed, or a person who couldn't forage at all, didn't automatically mean going hungry. The group absorbed the shortfall. Second, grandmothers. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, studying Hadza foraging patterns, proposed what's now called the grandmother hypothesis. The idea that older post-menopausal women's steady, reliable gathering of foods like tubers may have been significant enough to help shape the evolution of unusually long human lifespans after reproduction ends. In other words, some of the very people modern assumptions might dismiss as unable to contribute. The elderly, the physically limited, may have been doing some of the most consistent, dependable provisioning in the entire group. Put Shanidar 1, Man Bayak Burial 9, and Romito 2 next to the Hadza data, and a much larger picture comes into focus. Ancient survival was never a simple transaction where only hunters ate. It was a system built on gathering, sharing, and a demonstrated willingness across tens of thousands of years and multiple entirely unrelated cultures to keep people alive who could give almost nothing back in the form of food. That's not a footnote to the story of human survival. Increasingly, it looks like it was one of the load-bearing structures of that story all along. The next time you picture ancient life as a brutal contest where only the strongest hunters mattered, picture, instead, a man with one working arm and no working ears, fed and protected for years by people who had no obligation to keep him alive except that they chose to. Picture a young man, paralyzed from the waist down, cared for daily for a decade in a world with nothing we would recognize as medicine. Picture a teenage girl, buried in her mother's arms, having lived exactly the same life, eaten exactly the same food, and been held exactly as closely as everyone else around her. Long before hunting made the difference between life and death, something else already had.